right, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Fall Seminar Series presentation hosted by the SNF Centre for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University. My name is Dr. Sabrina Higgins, and I'm a professor with the Departments of Global Humanities and Archaeology. And with me is my colleague, Dr. Dimitris Krallis, the director of the SNF Centre for Hellenic Studies and a faculty member in Global Humanities here at SFU. And we will be responsible for moderating today's talk. Before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that this event is taking place at Simon Fraser University on Burnaby Mountain on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. Before I introduce today's presenter, I'd like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. And if you have questions or concerns about Zoom's privacy and security guidelines, I would ask you to visit SFU's IT services website. Online audience, if we run into a technical problem, we will update you in the chat, but please know that this event is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel at a later date. Now, I'm very pleased to present today's speaker, the host of the very popular podcast, Let's Talk About Myths, Baby. I had to mimic it. I had to.
I don't even do it in person. I do not.
I love it so much. It makes me happy. I'm like my 90s little child.
Do you know people don't know that it's a song reference?
I can't. No. Can't. Liv has a degree in English literature and classical civilizations from Concordia University in Montreal, where she studied ancient and Greece, Rome more broadly. With this background in the ancient world, she's able to convey really compelling humor and sarcasm-filled narratives about Greek mythology while also using an intersectional feminist lens to tell these stories. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome her today for a conversation about podcasting, mythology, feminism, and everything in between. Welcome, Liv.
Thank you. I have so much trouble hearing people say things about me.
Well, all well deserved. And I mean, you know, obviously how much I love your podcast. This is the second time that we've sort of had you at an event at Simon Fraser. The first time, though, that our students are invited in the room. So if you don't know, we had Liv here last year for a big conference that we organized on presenting the past. And we brought Liv in to do, well, a podcast episode and a interview panel where she talked about public scholarship. And so, you know, building on this theme of public scholarship, but podcasting in particular, for people who maybe aren't as familiar with your work in this room, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into the world of podcasting and your background?
Yeah. So we were just talking about this before, but it's funny because I started this show when I lived in Vancouver because the city made me really depressed and I needed an outlet for my depression, but it worked out very well. So I have Vancouver to thank, even though I only lived here for a year. I started it honestly because I was bored and sad and I had a soul-sucking job and I just started obsessively listening to podcasts. And I was like, I could do that. I could talk about Greek mythology. Like, why not? And then I decided that obviously it had to be funny because the one thing that people don't do enough is talk about Greek mythology like it is absurd and funny. And then it turned into feminist because I am an angry feminist at all times. It was unavoidable. But yeah, I mean, honestly, it just started because I just needed a thing to do. And then it just slowly ballooned into this thing where I'm like hyper aware of my sourcing and being, I mean, just ridiculously over the top in terms of my research and all of that. So it didn't really start intentionally so much as just kind of turned into this thing that is now really cool in my job and somebody else's job that I'm not pointing out.
So, I mean, you say this thing, and in our earlier conversation, that thing started having some texture, which is about 500 or so episodes. So it's a big thing. It's a hydra of multiple heads.
Yes. Oh, I like that.
See, but I mean, before 500 was episode 1. And
somebody assigned to her classes, and I wish
I got flagged for that, by the way.
And I wonder, from 1 to 500, do you see a learning curve? Can you trace this kind of development a bit?
Yeah, obsessively. My first episodes, while I love them and while listeners love them as much as I wish they I would like them to start elsewhere, because I don't think my first episodes are particularly smart. They just began as I think what was natural at the time, which is that I was like 6 years out of my BA, and I had not really touched Greek mythology in my life for so long, and I just wanted to talk about it because I loved it. And so, I'd sort of forgotten most of what I learned in school, and wasn't really concerned with my sourcing necessarily, and just kind of picked up whatever I found, and worked off of that. But in the end, I think that is actually so beneficial because I've learned from it, and I can look back at sourcing and even myself and be like, okay, these are the things that I would have liked to have done differently. And even like the book that I had found at the time and used, now I look back and I'm like, oh, it's misogynist drivel. Like, it's so bad. I reread the sections on Medusa and Pandora and like wanted like dry heave. But so just over the years, like the more I would learn and the more I would sort of interact with the classics world, primarily through Twitter, which was an enormous lifesaver. Like the more I realized kind of how I wanted the show to go, and it turned into me developing this obsessive understanding and obsession with using primary sources wherever possible, and like ensuring that, for in the beginning, I would tell like this one simple version of a myth. And now I'm like, okay, so let me talk to you about like the 4 different versions that we have and why they're different and from what time period. And what does that say that each one is from this different time period? And, so it went from just a very surface level reading of mythology to something that I'm incredibly proud of, and is, I think, a really, really beneficial way for people to learn these stories because of how I focus on the primary sources, but also, what that means for today and what impacts they might have and how we can read things a little bit differently because of, where we are today. So there's an enormous growth over those 500 years. I like to say that, like, I think end of 2019, definitely into 2020, are sort of like when it started to get really good in terms of, academic maybe quality. I would still never consider myself an academic, but more than just sort of real surface level readings of the stories.
So in a way, you trace a trajectory that takes you from a narrator of stories to narrator of whole traditions.
Yeah.
And I can see what you say there.
Yeah, and like the context more than anything, and cultural context and all of those things that I just find to be fascinating. So, yeah.
And I think the other side of podcasting is not just the research and the telling of stories, but also the technology behind it too,
Yeah.
which is its own beast that you have to kind of contend with. So, I mean, was that a huge learning curve for you on top of everything else?
Yeah, I'm an old millennial, so
Me too.
We figured it. We're very similar in age. And so I just Googled everything. I literally Googled like how to start a podcast, and I just like did the things that it told me. I bought a microphone, and then I bought a better microphone, and I learned the free audio editing program, which is still the one I use, because despite the fact that I could definitely afford to upgrade, I do not want to learn something else, and I know how to use that. So I very proudly, up to this day, do the absolute bare minimum of editing, and I like that. Nobody complains, and I just don't see the reason to expand at all. So it's very basic. I mean, a lot of people will ask like, oh, why don't you do video and you should record yourself recording? I'm like, absolutely not at all. I would avoid video at all costs if possible. So I like that it's kind of stayed in one, section, but I definitely just had to Google everything and figure it out as I went. The only reason I even have like a good quality microphone now and know how to use it is because I had to record the audiobook for my book.
Right.
And so they had a producer like talk me through new technology, and then I just never touched it again and just recorded in the same way. So yeah, it was a learning curve, but not one that I didn't make it a very high curve. I was like, let's just go to like here, this will work, and we'll just keep going from there.
I love that.
So you mentioned earlier, no, actually, you mentioned, no, Sabrina mentioned earlier, let's be clear, in the introduction, the feminist angle, and you elaborated a bit on the angry part. And that links to the next question, which is the focus of the podcast. Yes, mythology, but did you have a specific mythology focus, or were there other concerns, questions that you wanted to tie to that as you were developing the podcast from the beginning?
I mean, at very, very beginning, I like to say, and this is my entire memory of it, is that I was like really sad and bored at this job and was like, I don't even know how I ended up, but I was reading the Wikipedia page for Pasiphae and the Minotaur and the bull. And I just remember being like, this is ridiculous. Like, why don't people talk about it as if it's like an actual comedic thing? But then, of course, like inherent in that is also the like horror that is that story, you know, from just being a woman aspect. And yeah, the feminist came just very naturally because I don't know how to be any different. And so the more I'm reading these myths, trying to start this podcast, you know, I was like, well, I'll start at the beginning. I'll start at the theogony. And oh my God, well, Zeus. And then I think Zeus is episode 3. And I'm like, how can I tell this and not just make it all about, you know, how gross a lot of this is? And so it started very surface level in that respect, just being like, you know, Zeus is awful. Here are all the crimes he committed. And then, you know, of course, like as it grows and as I grow, it becomes like, it is still that, but I'm going to talk about like the cultural context behind that, you know, and just existing in this century too. So many things come up and I'm kind of constantly, you know, revisiting things and like, and breaking down, I think, a lot of what has become sort of the mainstream idea about these just entire Greek mythology as a concept of, well, that's just the way it was back then, you know, and well, it's fine. Like women were people, but like, that's just the way it was. I'm like, okay, like, let's talk about why you think that, because that's not true. And so, you know, the more I understood, the more it was like, okay, well, I wanted to look at the context behind why people think that, like who wrote these things down and how did they end up to us today that makes us believe that that's just the way things were. I don't even know where the question began because I can just talk and talk. But yeah, I mean, it just became like the show just had to be both comedic because, I mean, I think it's funny, but at the same time, like I'm not necessarily actively trying to be funny. And as a lot of men like to tell me, I'm not funny. But, you know, like it's ridiculous. And so I just started writing it in my own personality and it kind of came out like that. But also, you know, you get to something like the Homeric hymn to Hermes. You're like, this is just hilarious. But then the feminism I can't talk about the sheer volume of people that Zeus assaulted without that just coming out. So it sort of all became natural. The fact that the show really is still like 90% just my personality and how I want to talk and tell a story. And it just works, thankfully. So I don't know how to be another way.
It certainly works.
Yeah, definitely works. If we're sticking on the theme of feminism, and we were talking about this beforehand, I mean, I think your podcast, really from a public facing perspective, set the tone for a lot of the kinds of work that women can do in this field right now. And I want to bring this up because it's extremely timely if you're on Classics Twitter, in the sense that, you know, there is a new, very openly feminist translation of the Iliad that was just released by Emily Wilson, who's getting a lot of flack for, you know, providing a translation that paints women as women, as human beings. Oh my God. I'm very vocal about this because, of course, the Iliad is tied to mythology, and you know, you are a public-facing feminist scholar, and so I'm wondering if you maybe want to comment on that a little bit, that aspect of it.
I mean, I will take any reason to be an angry feminist on the internet, even if it always comes back to bite me and like often ruins my day, but I just do it anyway. But this one, I think, like, I don't know, it's just so exhausting sometimes to just like go on to like any social media, but of course, Twitter especially. And like, also I want to point out this book has been out for 3 days.
I know, 3 days. Yeah.
It's been out for 3 days. And I can not even count on one hand the number of men who have tried to tell me that what she did is not what Homer would have wanted. Homer, the singular, very real person, that's not what he would have wanted, okay? Some guy told me that he would have sided with the male translators who translate the word woman as like slut. He's like, well, he would have agreed with them. So you think you're talking? Yeah, it's truly wild. And so, you know, like I always want to defend that stuff, but I also think that having translations like this is just so incredibly important. And like, I also think it's important to remind people what it means to have a feminist translation, which is not that like women rule the world. Like one other guy on my Twitter said that Emily Wilson says that Achaea was a matriarchy. Anyway, like it's just, I think it's important to be like, to just have a translation where we just kind of mitigate some of the misogyny that has been infused into this work in the last 2,000 years. And I'm not even like, not changing the misogyny that's in there to begin with, because it's there, that's what we have. But so much of it is not what is in the original text. So much of it is what has been added by men over the last 2,000 years. And I think it's vital to go back and look and just think about why that is and what it could actually be like. Like last year I had Stephanie McCarter on my show, who did the feminist translation of Ovid. And you know, she's really outspoken that it was a feminist translation, but also she explains what that means, which is just literally, you know, looking at what the word is actually in the Latin in that case and translating it more true to the truth of the word. Like my favorite one is that she looked at all of these past translations where they had translated a word as breasts because it applied to a woman, and it was literally the word like pectoral. Like it was just chest muscles. Like we don't need to make it sexual just because she was a lady. And there were so many examples like that where she was like, I put it as pectoral muscles because that's a Latin word to begin with and we use it. Like, you know, so I think it's so important to have that. And I'm thrilled that the Iliad exists. But of course, you know, something like the Iliad is going to get even more pushback because it's all about men and war. And all these dudes have convinced themselves that it's about like the glory of war, misunderstanding the entire point of the Iliad, which is that it's not about that at all. And so, you know, I don't know, I just like to be loud, but I do think having these translations is so important. And as somebody who, you know, much to my own like continued fury, I do not know ancient Greek or Latin. My classics degree let me graduate with a classics degree without having done that. I'm still mad at them about it, but I have to read translations. And so I read multiple translations, and I know enough ancient Greek that I can click through, you know, a dictionary and figure out something if I want to. But having these translations is vital, and they just make such a difference. And I think that they're going to open up the ancient sources to so many more people who aren't just cisgender white men, and that's good. So I don't know. Yeah, I think it's vital. And like, you know, I don't even know anything about the translation yet, though I've heard from good people that it's also very good and very true to the Greek. But yeah, I mean, one of my tweets, and I stand by it, is that like, I haven't read it, I don't know how good it is, but I will defend her right to be able to translate it that way, like to within an inch of my life, because I just think that we should have that. And I'm thrilled that I get to be that person on the internet who is sharing this stuff in this way that is like very different, I think, from the way the mythology is otherwise put out into the world, which is just sort of, you know, the stories themselves. Like, I think it is so important to talk about everything behind and why the stories are the way they are, and how they got to be that way, and all the different things that happened in the intervening 2,000 to 3,000 years that ended up where we are. But also to do that with an eye towards like making women people, and recognizing that gender was not a binary back then, just like it's not now. And, you know, and I think it's just important for so many obvious reasons. Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think this question of translation renders is interesting because it links up so well with the broader question of mythology and of what you do with mythology, which is also interpretation and rendition and engagement with it on your own terms while trying to understand other people's terms. And translation does, to some degree, that.
Yeah.
And we have to be open to that. And of course, we can contest it, and the multiple translations again give you this kind of insight into the text, into the stories. A question that just came up listening to all this, to all this discussion about the misogyny online and so on and so forth. To what extent does it become a burden having to to fight that battle, where of course you want to present a certain view of the world as you see it, and your point of view is a feminist point of view. That's fantastic. But to what extent do you ever find yourself, I'm exhausted by this?
Yeah. So on Wednesday it was like I do Patreon episodes. And Wednesday was the day that so the book came out on Tuesday. So obviously on Wednesday, the internet was furious. And I tweeted about it very happily, and I engaged with a couple of people happily. And then it just evolves, right? You just get this onslaught of these people. And the most depressing part is just the way that these men think that they're right. And they would just keep going and going and going. And the number of people I have in my mentions who are ignoring the fact that I am telling them all of this historical context that is accurate and I clearly know what I'm talking about. And, it just keeps going in circles and circles. And yeah, it became exhausting to the point on Wednesday where I was supposed to record this Patreon episode where I am me. And, the thing about the show, what's good and also can be really difficult about the show is that it is entirely my personality. It's just who I am as a person. I put on a little bit of a voice, but otherwise it's just me as a person. And because it is only me, it is also my entire existence at this point. It is my job. It is my livelihood. It is my entire social media presence, because I wish still that I had made my Instagram account private from day one, and I didn't. So it's just I can't escape it. And so it does become really overwhelming. And sometimes, I have to write a weekly podcast. It's 5,000 to 6,000 words, and trying to do that if you're really depressed is really difficult. I'm going to write 5,000 words about being funny and also read 7 ancient texts while I'm doing it. But thankfully I had already finished that week, because just even the Patreon, which is just me answering people's questions, I couldn't do it. And I ended up recording a thing where I was I'm not going to give you nothing. I'm actually going to half cry into a microphone and explain why I'm not giving you this thing that I owe you. Because it was just it just completely tore apart my day. And that happens sometimes, sometimes I'll go months without it, because I'm often pretty good at brushing things off. But in that case, it was sort of this, angry dudes on the internet suck, but it was more so just this sort of weight of the fact it's just this constant kind of reminder that there is just a huge subset of people who seem to think that I have no place in this field, that even Emily Wilson, who clearly has proven herself, seemingly does not have a place in this field because she's a woman. And it just, it becomes very exhausting sometimes. And it would never stop me from doing it. But there's been times where I'm less, I don't want to say political, because it's literally just treating people as humans, but the angry people call it politics, where I'm not quite so outspoken in the episodes because I just can't be. But then I have people being well, why haven't you talked about this? And I'm well, because I'm a human being who has to do this every day, and sometimes I can't. So no, sometimes it's very difficult.
And I can imagine it's especially difficult too, because for those of us who are on Classics Twitter and sort of actively participating in that world, it's its own beast. If you're not on Classics Twitter, I don't know if I'm encouraging you to do it, but
it has changed my life in the best possible ways. But also, sometimes it is a dumpster fire.
But in terms of you as a presence within classical social media, you really are one of the faces I think people associate with classics and feminism. And so where, there are certainly a multitude of women and men engaging in sort of feminist reinterpretations or feminist scholarship, you have the biggest following. And it's sort of, I think, can get exhausting because it's often always directed at you. Or people expect you to respond.
It's the expectation. Sometimes it can be really difficult because I'm I agree, I should be part of this, but sometimes I can't because I'm one human who also has feelings. But people forget that on the internet a lot, it's a lot sometimes. It's usually fine, but sometimes I just have to take a step back, because also just by making a comment, because it is expected of me, it is opening myself up to just an onslaught of vitriol and awfulness. Even my reviews are sometimes like that, angry men. And one thing I've really noticed, and I think it's really interesting and also infuriating, is that like in the last, say 3 months, there has been an enormous uptick in this very specific type of man on the internet. And it is what I'm going to call the Barbie man, because it is the type of man who is being forced to face the realization that not everything is for them. And you can just not like a thing. And it doesn't have to, like, you don't have to flip out because you don't like this one thing, because maybe it wasn't made for you. But like, honestly, I could track it from the Barbie movie of me getting a bunch of reviews being like, I don't know why she won't just talk about the myths. I'm like, well, because my show has always been a feminist mythology show. It's 6 years old and there's 500 episodes. Do you want me to change it now? I'm not going to. Or I've had people be like, well, she's gotten really feminist in recent years. And I was like, what are you talking about?
Have they met you?
Day one of this show was me like, it's just wild and it's delusional and reviews are the most frustrating because one, you cannot reply and they actually affect my like livelihood. And it's usually just like a man being angry that a thing isn't for him. And I'm like, well, just find a different mythology show. But the problem is that I'm the biggest. So every time they want to go learn about Greek mythology, they're faced with this angry feminist and they get really mad about it.
But plus, they probably have students who come to class. If
Yeah.
you have academics who get
Yeah.
pissed off. And,
Yeah.
Where did you hear that?
I've never heard from an angry academic, which is a real point of pride.
So we're learning.
Yeah. Yeah. Or the ones who are angry don't know how to use the internet, which is very possible because the angry ones are the older ones. But yeah, I mean, no, it's always just like dudes who want to believe the Western civilization myth that Greek mythology and ancient Greece is just a bunch of smart men talking about smart things. And they were probably really light and, all of these different wild notions that the world has forced down our throats. And they're mad that I'm just in here talking about, accurate representations of history.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just the feminism. I mean, again, one of the things that draws me to your work specifically is that, yes, that there's a feminist lens, but you also very specifically engage and amplify the voices of trans and non-binary people in your work.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you can talk about why using sort of mythology to amplify those voices is really important to what you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting to like hear that question and try to answer it because it's not like a conscious decision I made, I just like, I think it probably, I'm trying to think of what the first episode would have been. It was really early on. And I think I just was reading Ovid and found the myth of Iphis and Ianthe and was like, this is so fun. Look, this is an ancient story of like, at the time I was like, you could read it as a trans person, or you could read it as like a lesbian couple who were given like this kind of way for them to be together in a world that wouldn't let them, like all these different kind of readings of it. And I just was like, this is really fun and cool. How nerdy, like I'm going to share it. And that was very early days. And then obviously lots of stuff changed. There's also episodes of my show that praise a certain author who since that time made clear that she was an awful person. And so, I also I always want to make sure that I remind people that I don't agree with the comments I made back then. And I did at the time because it wasn't clear. And, a fun thing about podcasts is that they live on the internet forever and people go to them in 2023 and they pick an episode that very clearly says 2017. And they're like, why do you say this? And I'm like, well, because 6 years happened. But yeah, so, it just came naturally of like wanting to tell those stories because I think it's cool and interesting. And then it became more important because of course it became more important to amplify those voices and just like this kind of constant reminder, that those stories exist, which is both interesting and cool. And also like really good, like things to use to fight back against transphobia, being like, hey, guess what? Like Ovid knew about it. So chill out.
This isn't a new development.
It's not brand new. So it started naturally and then became like really important just because I think people are all people. I don't know.
Well, you were doing a series where it's the month of July, correct? Where it was
like June, I always do Pride episodes.
June is
Yeah.
Pride month,
I'm really running out though, so I don't know what I'm going to do next year because as much as there are some, there's not a lot. But yeah, no, I always try to do something like that, and thankfully now that I have guests on the show, like that's going to be endless. But yeah, I mean, I think it's important all the time. A lot of people commented being like, you really should be doing this year round because if you focus it on Pride, it sounds like you're doing, like lip service or whatever. And I'm like, well, the problem is there's not enough. If there were enough, I would absolutely, but I might as well make it a big fun month.
Yeah.
Cause also I like to give myself a theme because it makes coming up with ideas considerably easier. So yeah, but yeah, I think it's just important generally. But also, it's just interesting to have those stories.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, because I mean, as you said, there are not as many of them as the regular myths, right?
Yeah.
So it's nice to kind of introduce an audience to stories that, with this abundance of myth that we have that may have somehow got lost in what they're learning in university, right? So they come to your podcast for that kind of material.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's so much of that, like well beyond queer stories generally, like all the stuff that's kind of left out because the dudes have been writing the books for so long. It's fun to just find those extra weird things that most people don't know. Yeah.
This really tangential question out of curiosity, which you just said, the dudes have been writing these stories. And I really wonder, is there some sort of 19th century public school book or series of books that can be traced behind this kind of narrowing of the interpretation? So suddenly we only know those myths as that, we know what Homer believes, because William something the third wrote about it somewhere in Rugby, and ever since this is how we learned it, and we move with it because it is such a closing of the interpretative kind of possibility of myth that you wonder, where did the closing happen? But this is just a tangential thought. Rolling on with the conversation and with strange people and opinions on the internet. You did some material on Atlantis, and of course, this brings us to the broader question of conspiracy theories and what draws you to this kind of material other than Atlantis. Cool.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I like just sort of dispelling these notions that have become so enormous that if they've like kind of like Atlantis is a good example of like this idea that it's completely overshadowed the actual ancient sources. And I came to it, I mean, mostly because there was like that Discovery Channel documentary that was coming out, and a lot of people online in my kind of circles were talking about it. And then, at the time I had sort of vague notions. I was like, Atlantis is like a thing from Plato, but I kind of, even then I sort of assumed it was a myth because I grew up in the 90s, and like, you just assumed it was a myth because it sounds like a myth and people treat it like it's a myth. And then I think I went and was like, wow, it's not a myth. And I was like, I want to share that. Like, and I think it was really, I just like, I mean, a lot of the stuff when I want to talk about that stuff, it also usually has ties to like, well, this is ultimately a white supremacist notion that a lot of people don't know is a white supremacist notion. So I like to come at it as, well, let me kind of open it up to the people who I think, might have been interested in the myth and would like to know the background that is not so common. I think I'm just like, clearly I just want, to spread, I guess, the truth. I don't know. It's weird to phrase. And I think it's also just like, I find it interesting. Like I was coming at it and I was reading it and sort of, it was blowing my mind as it was all kind of, as I was writing the scripts, I was learning more and more. And so that was a good example of, I could come at something as, I could kind of treat myself like the layman, like I didn't know, and sort of learn through that, because I think that's also a much more beneficial way to teach somebody something. Like, if somebody has it in their head that Atlantis is this story, and they've this historical notion that they have it deep in their soul that that's true, like they don't want you to tell them that not only is that does it have absolutely no basis in history or mythology or anything, but also it has really strong ties to really problematic stuff. Like they don't want to hear that in a way that they're going to take as condescending, no matter how much you do it. So I wanted to come at it as, hey, I didn't know either. This is what I thought, I grew up with that Disney movie, like, this is what I thought. And hey, actually, this is what the truth is. Isn't that super cool? And I think that's a really good way of coming at something, because it doesn't feel confrontational. It's just like, hey, look at this. But then I did the one bad review I got about Atlantis was somebody who was like, oh my God, she didn't know it was Plato. Like, what a dummy. Like, ugh. And I was like, dude, that was the point. Like, that was actually the point, was to come at it like that. But yeah, you know, it's interesting, but I like that nerdy stuff. And then sometimes it gets me into trouble because it's a lot more work to want to dispel those kinds of notions. Like the Sparta myth of Sparta was the one I did more recently. So I try to do that very minimally though, because it's a lot more work.
So I suppose that the myth of Sparta probably got you a lot of angry right-wing.
Didn't.
Oh,
Yeah, I got like
surprising.
2 reviews. I was expecting a lot. I was like ready to be afraid.
Marjorie Taylor Greene writing.
Yeah. I mean, it was probably when the January 6th hearings were going on or close to it. Like, yeah, I was expecting that one to be dark, and it wasn't. Most of my listenership is actually really chill. I get very little hate for how, for my show specifically, like the times I have to deal with difficult or awful people on the internet is usually because I tweeted something feminist or I posted on Instagram something outward, but it's very rarely actually about the podcast.
The haters don't have time to listen.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I guess. Yeah, or they just see it's made by a woman and they're like, well, I won't even try, you know, so they can't even get angry because they don't know what he's saying. I don't know. Yeah, but I'm constantly surprised at how little I actually get from the show itself, save for the men who are just mad that it's not the thing that they want it to be.
I really appreciate the rhetorical strategy of coming from a position of not knowing and of self-doubt as you try to open a subject to others. Talking to nationalist Greeks, I find that this is perfect. Let's look at this. Let's look at this. Isn't it surprising?
Yeah.
See what they've been hiding from you? So you turn your own conspiracy theory. And
Yeah. I mean, it's so much better than confrontation because everyone's gonna like, obviously you get defensive when somebody comes at you with that. Nobody wants to feel like they don't know what they're talking about or like they're stupid. So, you know, it's much better to come at it that way, even though then sometimes people will be like, oh my God, you're stupid. I'm like, well, okay. You're kind of defeating the purpose now. But,
I mean, I have to say, so I actually was re-listening to the Atlantis, the first episode today, the bus ride up, and the way that you present it and kind of almost self-deprecating, like, oh, I didn't know this. It gave me permission to do the same, even as an academic, which was really refreshing in the sense that, you know, there's so much that even I don't know about the story of Atlantis, and the way you were presenting it just made me feel so okay not knowing all those things. And so I don't think it's even necessarily something that only people who are going to come at this from, you know, like a very misogynist point of view and are going to attack you, like to do it, to try to get them on board. But even as someone who like lives and breathes in this broader sort of Greek archaeology field, I was like, oh my goodness, this is so refreshing that like Liv, the expert on myths, didn't know this. Like, oh, it's okay that I didn't too. And I find that approach to your podcast so refreshing and so accessible, which is why I assign it all the time too to my students, because like it helps you get there.
Yeah, well, also like it's just fun and cool, and I know that that's why my show can be more accessible, because I'm just coming at it like, look at this fun and cool thing, and it makes, I think it makes it more fun for everyone. But it is like, it's a nicer way to learn when you don't know. Atlantis though is a funny one because it's like nobody knows anything because there is nothing to know. So in order to know stuff about Atlantis, you have to be in on the conspiracy, because if you actually know anything about the actual notion of Atlantis, there's nothing to know.
There's nothing.
And that's what's interesting and cool.
Yeah. And triremes 12,000 years ago. That was the thing that was like, wait, we're talking about triremes?
Athens 12,000 years
Even
ago
that,
being
yeah.
a supreme power, like news to me. We're not bigger in the Iliad.
But this sort of brings me to my actual question, Liv, which is like, being someone who's a public facing scholar gives you a completely different freedom to talk about academic materials in a way that maybe Dimitri and I can't with our students. And so, you know, how does that sort of freedom, this separation from the academy help you in your work?
It's funny, like I would never consider myself a scholar. Like the first time I've ever even been like kind of told I was anything like that was at the colloquium. because I just am always like, I don't know, I have a BA and it's 10 years old and I don't remember anything from it. So like most of me now is self-taught. Like I don't know how much I can attribute to my BA. You guys have it really good now. You're learning so much more cool stuff. Like I hear about these classes and I'm like, I'm actually so jealous. There was nothing like that when I was studying. So just, take advantage. But yeah, I don't see myself like that. And I also don't know where to like look at academic stuff. So I very rarely even access anything. Like 9 times out of 10, if I'm even looking at an academic thing beyond, some book that I could Google and find, it's because my assistant producer, who I'm not going to point out, has like provided it for me because she goes to UBC and like has access to these things. So I don't know, like everything I found has also just been like kind of piecemeal along the way, like discovering this text or this source or something. But mostly I just look at ancient sources so that I don't have to deal with the academia like at all. So I don't even know. I just kind of I just see myself as being so separate, which is kind of funny because I have academics on my show like almost every week. So I don't know. I've never even considered myself, I've ever been part of it, so I don't see myself as outside of it either.
Mm-hmm. I feel like also, to your praise, the fact that you can get these very serious academics on your show speaks to the level.
People think I'm really cool.
Okay, obviously you're cool, but like to the level of trust they have in you to tell those stories, right?
Yeah,
like, that's pretty fantastic.
I mean, honestly, that's mine. Sorry, just plus 44. I'm sure it's super legit. So yeah, I mean, like that was the biggest thing in the world for me was when, like, even so, just talking about having these academics and scholars on my show and everything like that happened so randomly. Like I originally my show only had 1 episode a week, and then the pandemic hit and I, for a very brief period, had extra time. So I was like, what if I just read a copyright-free translation of the Iliad on the show? Because I like the sound of my voice, apparently, which I actually don't. I don't even listen back to anything. There's absolutely no quality control on my show, which is ridiculous. But like so I started having these 2 episodes a week, and then when I was running out of the Odyssey, there was like Women's Month, and I just happened to tweet, like, because I had found myself with some kind of mutual Twitter relationship with a bunch of scholars and stuff. And so I just tweeted out once, like, hey, would anyone want to come on my show and like maybe talk about like a woman from the ancient world? And I got such a response that I was like, oh, lots of people want to come on my show and talk about this. Like, okay. And then it just started being slowly inundated, and it just became like, oh, I guess I'm doing this all the time because it's so cool. But yeah, I mean, it's so flattering, and it definitely gave me this kind of like self-assurance that I never would have gotten otherwise. And I don't necessarily think that I really like needed it, but me personally, I needed it. Like, I think my show was probably going to end up the same way with or without it. But I needed that praise. I needed to feel like I contributed something good and smart in a way that, I think it's kind of elitist that it took people from that world praising me for me to feel that. And so that's kind of wrapped up in so many other things. But it was very lovely. And yeah, a lot of people want to come on. Like, one of my favorite things when I did the Sparta series is that the biggest name in Sparta that I had on the show, I didn't go to him, he came to me, and he was like, Stephen Hodgkinson was like, I think I'd like to come on and talk about Sparta. Would you be interested? And I was like, and I Googled him, and like, oh, like, yeah. And then his name was on like all the articles we were using. And, so yeah, it's very nice to be seen as serious enough, despite the fact that I swear more than I reasonably should. And I say the most absurd things. And like, one of my favorite lines from the show's history is castration foam. Like, despite all of that, I'm very well respected. That's cool.
And of course, we should point out how jealous we all are for the audience you have. Right? I mean, as people who we might write some books or some articles that 100 people will read, and then here you are with this vast audience.
It's fairly large.
Yes. and it's okay. It's a tribute to the quality that people want to come, but at the same time, there's something in it for them, right? This is an exposure that they can get beyond the narrow confines of academic publishing. That is inconceivable for a modern academic who has not really made it. Who's not made a beer.
Yeah.
So this is really interesting, and I really appreciate the fact that here we are at the intersection of. I mean, you are a perfect interface into a wider world for academia, and we need this discussion. So we are often so insular, and I don't think that our universities are yet clear what they want us to be as academics, because we have not decided what research is and what it will be in the modern world, and we need bums on seats, but publish. But what are you publishing? Who's reading it? And here you are with opening these vast audiences. So in a way, we need you, and we need more people like you. And we're trying to also think, okay, how do we reimagine ourselves as we do our own work here?
Yeah. Well, I also think it's like it's a tribute to just like nerds on the internet like my episodes with scholars on like really nerdy niche things get just as many downloads as my narrative episodes where I tell some exciting story. And coming back to the people wanting to be on the show for that too, like my favorite thing is when they'll ask me for the download numbers, because a lot of times it's going on CVs and stuff. Because I've also learned that like some universities will kind of count them going on my show as like something. I don't know how it all works, but like sometimes it's counted and sometimes it's not, like it's not, published enough or whatever it is. But I do get to give download numbers to these people. Oh my God, can you believe it? Or like, oh, that must be one of your lower numbers. And I'm like, no, you get the high ones. Don't worry. Like it's really fun on that too. Like, I think it does, it's mutually beneficial, but also like people want to learn it. And most of my listeners are just any old random person who Googled Greek mythology podcast, and yet they want to hear an episode on like some really silly niche thing in the ancient world. And that's so cool. Like that, I think it's really good information for the world beyond the academy to be like, hey, people like this stuff, regardless of whether you're sitting in a university class or whatever. Like, it's just cool and fun to learn. And so, yeah, I think that it's great that people want to come on for me, but also, yeah, it's great for them spreading their research beyond, like you're saying, a book that sells 100 copies or whatever, and it also like costs $100 or, all these different things. So it's nice to have podcasts generally that can be kind of spreading that. And I like to make sure that they don't have to put any work in, because I hate asking people to do work for me. So I'm like, just come on, sit for an hour and a half and just tell me things that live in your brain, and then we're going to make it great. Like, yeah, I don't know. It's very fun.
Okay. So we're going to try to wrap things up so we can open the questions to the audience.
I told you I can talk too much.
No. This has been amazing, Liv. But I want to sort of ask something that maybe is more to the benefit of all the amazing students from our classes who've shown up in the room today. And that's, if you have any advice to the students here or who are listening online that might be interested in using their classics, archaeology, or Mediterranean history degrees outside of sort of traditional academia.
Yeah. I feel like I should have like some brilliant answer for this question, which I get asked a lot, but I do think I'm just a good example that like you can do weird, random nerd things. Because people like that stuff, and the internet is great for that, as much as it's also like an absolute menace. Like there's so many different ways to do that. Like I have a lot of friends now who are considerably younger than me and have like whole TikTok careers because they talk about the ancient world. And I think that's incredibly cool. And so it's just sort of nice to know that there are these like outlets that where you can use the degree that, I mean, in my case, I got my classics degree for fun. I had every intention of working in publishing and never touching it again, besides just like being a nerd. And now I'm like, oh, this is the one I'm using more than my English major. And I think that's just, I don't know. I wish I had better like actual advice, but it's cool that just you can do nerdy things. And I mean, there's so many other different outlets and stuff, but I
feel like if you fully jump in and embrace the nerdiness and like be completely authentically yourself as a nerd, like that is where the magic happens, right?
Yeah, I think, the authenticity and like the problem with podcasting too is like I got into it at a really, really good time in a lot of ways. Like I got into podcasting before it blew up to the point where it's really hard now to grow to the degree that I have. But also I got in completely accidentally right before the Greek mythology boom. Like I just was like, I'm a nerd for Greek myth, I'm gonna start this show. And then like 3 months later, Lore Olympus existed, and like everything just blew up, and now it's like the most common type of novel coming out, I swear. So many different things can kind of happen, but I think that that's a good example of like that can happen anytime, and there's going to be a constant love and obsession with the ancient world well beyond academics. Yeah, I hope that was an answer.
No, that's great. All right, so maybe we'll open it up to the floor. If anyone here or anybody who is online has any questions, if you're online, type them into the chat, and Heather and Wallace will read them out to us. Anyone in here? Any questions for Liv? Yes, Adriana.
Yeah, I was wondering if you have a specific type of episode that you like to record the best, because I know you do sometimes the talks with guests, or just reading the myths, or just your own kind of working with content. Do you have a favorite out of all those?
It depends on my mood. I love recording with guests, but I also have extreme social anxiety. And so like, it's a real love-hate relationship. I tend to do it in like chunks. So I just went through a period where I recorded like 2 a week, if not more, for a while. And now I'm like, okay, I'm going to breathe. I'm going to take some time off from that. So they're always really fun in the moment, but getting into that moment. And often people are nervous because they've heard me before. And I'm like, but I'm nervous. So if you're nervous, like it's going to be really bad. But I also I love reading things aloud. I don't know why. I just love it so much. But sometimes narrative episodes will just kind of like come upon me in the super fun way. And like, I won't see it coming necessarily. Like, you're right there. What was the episode recently where I was like in it recording and was like, this is the most fun I've ever had? It was Bellerophon, wasn't it? Thank you. So like, I was writing it and I was like, this is really fun. And then I was recording it and I was like, this is the greatest thing ever. And so it just kind of will happen out of the blue, where just some story, or I've been able to tell something in some specific way that just makes it so much fun. And then sometimes it's a slog, and sometimes it's a really big bummer, and I can hear it while I'm recording it that it's not very good, but it's too late. And I also do one narrative a week, so I'm like, well, I can't take it back now, so I guess it's just gonna go out there. So it's just, I don't know, it's also getting comfortable with that idea that's difficult, and it's just kind of like, well, I guess we'll just figure it out later. There's going to be another one next week. That definitely did not answer your question, but that's just kind of how it all goes. There is no real favorite beyond how I'm feeling at any given time.
Yes, Isabella.
This is more of just like a comment of praise and
Hey.
whatnot. I'm so sorry. I did my 5-star review in person
Hey.
because I listen on Spotify.
Have you been engaging with the new questions and stuff that I can ask?
I saw in the Hercules episode, but I know nothing about your show.
Right. All right.
I'm so sorry.
Okay, there'll be more.
I'm very excited. But I think that your podcast is such a fantastic bridge between kind of just like, growing up with Percy Jackson and Atlantis and all these fun things, and getting into the academic world, not just as like an introduction. I just searched up the mythology podcast and here I am, but I find myself now really being able to look at things like primary sources in these wonderful professors' classes, and look at things through different lenses and apply that to different stories as well, and be a little bit more. It gives me tools, and I did have a feminist slip in class in front of these professors who were very lovely. One of our other professors teaching the class was introducing the Oresteia, and he was like, oh yes, he has to avenge his father because his mother killed him. And I went, are you gonna tell us why?
She had a good reason. Okay.
I had to just shove my tongue back in so that you have all the credit in the world.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great example though of like Greek mythology it was both like this broad thing that has all of these different, you know, avenues that you can look at, but also so often it has been narrowed into this thing that's what happened. Clytemnestra bad, like Agamemnon good somehow, you know, and I think I'm a good example of like over 500 episodes, my opinions have changed, and like, because everything changes the more you read it. And so I hear that from people a lot too, of like, I've grown with you as I've listened, and my thoughts and opinions have grown. And I mean, that's the fun of having been doing it for this long. But I also think, yeah, like, I'm glad it benefits you in class and stuff too.
Yeah.
But having an obsession with ancient sources, I think, probably benefits people doing degrees more than it benefits any random person listening. So I'm glad people find it good.
It helps the academics because I think it helps us look at sources differently.
Yeah.
Because you come at it from I don't know what I'm talking about, taking us through it, holding our hand, and like being able to look at things critically. And you know, I listen to philosophy podcasts now where I'm like, I could apply my thinking cap to this because it taught me how.
Bigger than I'm willing to do. I don't touch philosophy. So well done. But thank you.
Any other questions? No? Okay. Oh, yeah.
So question more, another moment of praise for you.
Twist my arm.
Yeah, and it's about the really early episodes too. So
Okay.
sorry, that's
I'm really sorry. I'm supposed to.
But I think that's where I started back in like 2019.
Everyone knows that.
Well,
Thank
so-
you.
so I mean, chronological, but part of what I liked most about it was how accessible it was and the sound of that original microphone.
And my cat purring into it.
Yes, because that felt accessible. I knew nothing about Greek mythology at all. Didn't know where to go into it. So starting that episode, hearing you talk about, sorry, the microphone wasn't very good. It felt like we were in it together.
Yeah.
You know, like I didn't know what I was doing, but you were gonna show me, and yeah, I mean, I'm university now, so
Well, thank you. That's very
I like
cool.
it.
Somehow I just you saying that has I don't know the last time I've listened to it, but I realize it starts with "Welcome to the first time I speak into a microphone" or something like that, and it just like keeps screaming back to me. So thank you. It's been a long time.
All right. Anyone else? No? Well, if not, Liv, thank you so much for sort of taking us through your process and the way that you have sort of worked through this 500 episode catalog, and, you know, just really giving us a sense of how public facing scholarship can be so impactful on students and scholars alike. And just want to reiterate how important and amazing I think your work is. And you know, this is the biggest audience we've ever had for one of our seminar series. And I really appreciate the fact that, you know, this kind of work speaks to so many of our students. And yes, just thank you so much for taking the trip over from Victoria to come be here.
So far.
So far.
What?
It's an odyssey.
Yeah. I
Lives on
thought
it.
about that after coming here. I tweeted about it and I didn't say that, and I was like, I could have made a comment about a wine dark sea that I had to pause, and I didn't. Missed opportunity. So thank you.
And for those of you who are,
2 questions.
we
online.
have,
I have a question.
we have an online question.
Yay.
We have a question from Flavia from Winnipeg.
We love Flavia. We love Flavia.
She would like to know if you see your work as a means of accessibility to the ancient world, and thank you for your work.
Oh, thank you, Flavia. Like, I guess now, yeah. It's so I really didn't start this with any plan to like be respected. But yeah, I think now, like, I'm incredibly proud of how I do it, which is why I don't recommend the first episode, because there are just such better things to work with. But yeah, I mean, I think I've introduced I know I've introduced a lot of people to it. I've heard from a lot of people who've been like, I started listening in high school and I just finished university and then I feel incredibly old. But it's really nice. And like, I do think making it accessible in this fun and silly way is really helpful, because people put it across as it's like this stuffy thing or really serious or all just war and violence and whatever, but it's really nerdy and silly and fun. And often the stuff that if you just are vaguely interested and you pick up a random book, you're very often gonna find stuff that is just like sad and misogynistic, but you don't know that it's misogyny because it's just there on the page and you think that that's right. Now I'm rambling again, but like, yes, I think I'm a great access point to the ancient world because I'm going to point out the things that have been misspoken about, I guess, over the last, however long. Yeah.
Other online questions? That was it?
Nothing else is coming yet.
Okay, well,
No, more.
well, let's keep going. Kieran.
Question out of curiosity, before you were talking about how there's the big Greek mythology boom and like there's so many novels and retellings coming out now. I was just wondering if you've like read or interacted with any of the novels and any thoughts on them, because I feel like I see so many differing opinions. Like some people love them, and then some people will be like, here's a 20-point list by everything wrong with this book.
Yeah.
I hate it. So I'm just curious.
Yeah.
If you have any thoughts.
Well, so I've definitely read a lot over the past years, and I feel very strongly, and this is like broader than Greek mythology, I feel very strongly about just like letting people like things. Like if I was to read a book and then be like, well, if you want me to tell you mythologically what it changed or went wrong or whatever, like that's a question. But I mean, I think let people like things. It's a novel. I do think sometimes it's too bad because I think sometimes people will read things and think that it's 100% true to the myth. And I'm like, well, no, like it's a novel. So, people will come with interesting opinions. But yeah, I mean, I've read a lot now though. I made a rule for myself at the beginning of the year that I can't read any more of them because they're work in a way that I read myth all day, every day. And so unfortunately now they're not fun, but that's a me problem. That's not the novel's problem. It's like, I'm reading one, which is coming out next year because a good friend of mine wrote it. And it is a space odyssey retelling of Ariadne and Dionysus. It's called Crown of Starlight. It's like Star Wars meets Greek myth. It's amazing and weird. And like, it's so good, but every time I'm reading it, I'm like, oh, this is the decision that they made, for this part of the myth. Oh, and this is an interesting decision. Like it's just work. So it's not like me just like escaping into a novel anymore. So that's like, I can't read them much anymore. But I mean, I think it's just great because the more novels about the ancient world, like the better, the more people are introduced to it. Like I didn't grow up with Percy Jackson, but so many of my listeners came to it with like they came to me because of Percy Jackson, and that's so cool. And so I think the more the merrier, and I just think it's great. I do think because I have my own feelings about like specifically Hades and Persephone style stories that I just don't talk about, but there is also a new book coming out that's like a Demeter getting her story told and kind of taking it back from that, and I'm really excited for that. Will I be able to read it? Who knows? But again, that's a me problem. But yeah, I think it's great. I think it's awesome.
Yeah. I was just wanting to ask, how do you go about sort of picking your topics for the episodes? You mentioned you like themes, but just in general, do you just kind of go through a list of all the stories?
I also have really bad ADHD when I'm only just vaguely trying to medicate. So often it's like spur of the moment. Like sometimes I plan things in advance. Poor Michaela has to deal with my ADHD like all the time because she is a planner. And my assistant producer is sitting in the front, sorry. But it's like, so sometimes I'll like plan really far in advance. So like right now I'm working on stuff that I've planned in advance because it's spooky season and it is my favorite time to do any kind of episodes. But sometimes it's just like, oh, if I don't have a theme, it's like I don't know, because the list now is totally unhelpful because I've covered everything on like almost any list. So it's very random at times, and just me kind of like pulling stuff out of nowhere and being like, well, I guess I'll just do this today. It's not a great way of doing it, to be honest. I don't recommend it. It's just the way it is at this point. Yeah. Because I'm getting down to like, I'm not going to stop anytime soon. So it's just going to become more and more difficult, but we're running low on like myths that I haven't already told. Yeah.
I'm curious about like, what's your thought process behind, like if a myth has multiple tellings and they don't agree with each other.
Yeah.
What's your thought process behind deciding which one to tell first or which one to tell in general?
I used to just like pick the ones that I wanted to tell, or that I found to be like most interesting, or sometimes is it most detailed, because often it's like this alternate version has like one sentence in one source. But now I'm like, I always have to tell all of them, which I think maybe is not to my listeners' benefit, but I can't stop. And so like, I just find it interesting though. Like, I love that there are so many different versions, and talking about, you know, why one might survive or why one might be more fragmentary, or like, well, what does it say that, I think of the, like a good example of this. But, you know, so often it's like everything we have survives after, well, what was it? It's a Heracles one. It was like everything after, around like 1st century CE phrased something one way, and everything before was like missing something entirely different. And I think that's really interesting. Like, what does it say about like when the Romans were coming in, that then now everything we have, or it was something about like his birth or something, where like nothing about this really famous aspect of his story. I love that I can't remember what it was, but this really famous aspect of his story, like nothing existed about that prior to the 1st century CE, whereas it's like the thing we all know about him. And so I'll often just like tell all the different versions, because I want to talk about that. I want to talk about like why, or like how weird is that? Or my favorite thing now is to really emphasize something that I think most people coming at Greek mythology, just as like any interested person, just has no idea about. Greek myth becomes flattened into this like one thing. And it's so interesting to be like, there's like 1,000 years worth of stories changing, and like reasons why some things survived and some things didn't. And I think that's so interesting and so vital to understanding how these stories exist, and why to look at the fact that there is 1,000 years worth. Because so often people will come to me and be like, well, why does this version say this and this say that? I'm like, because there's like 600 years that happened. Like, imagine Shakespeare is going to say something really different about something that we would, than how we would say it today. And I think that's just so often forgotten, because you just pick up a book of Greek myths and it's like, this is what happened, you know? So now I'm just a nerd, and I pick all of them and I make it really over the top, and it's probably not that narratively like satisfying.
As a really recent arrival to your work, and since you mentioned Heracles, I felt that this episode was just such a phenomenal introduction to philology, and to the work that goes into how you follow stories across different texts, and who preserves what and where and how. And the first thing that happens when you mention philology in a classroom is usually glazing of eyes, etc. And I'm thinking, whoa, it can be done really in a vibrant way.
It's really cool.
Exactly. Yes, and it can be drawn in stemmata and made to look scary, but at the same time, when you narrativized in a way that makes it accessible. And now I need to start assigning it, because it is a really good way to get people to think about what exactly you were talking about. Sources and layers and provenances and so on and so forth.
Yeah, well, and it can just be so daunting, because it is dense and difficult, and like, yeah, often it is really dry. Like, one of my favorite books to work with for the show is the Early Greek Myths 2-volume set by Timothy Gantz, because it's just really valuable and just like lays it all out, but it's so dry and difficult. Like, people have been like, oh, maybe I should go get it. And like the listeners will tell me that, I'm like, don't, just listen to me. Like, you're not going to enjoy reading it. It's not a read for fun book. It's this is what this source says, and this is like, you know, it's really great for me, but I think that it can be done in this really interesting way. And it's just, yeah, often isn't. Because I think people don't emphasize how like cool and weird and interesting it is that these things have happened over the 1,000-year period. It's rather just like, oh, this survives where this is lost, or yeah, I don't know. It's fascinating.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, again, Liv, I want to thank you so much for coming. And just a few housekeeping things before we sign off. So I want to let you know about our next presentation, which will take place on Friday, October 6th at 2:30 with Julia Tulke of Emory University, and her talk, Aesthetics of Crisis, Political Street Art and Graffiti in Athens, 2013 to 2023. And if you want to know any additional information on the speakers for the semester, it can be found on our website at sfu.ca/Hellenic Studies/newsroom. And for those of you who are here in person in traditional Hellenic Studies fashion, we invite you to join us at Beercraft for snacks and drinks, where we will be heading to next. So thank you again, Liv.
Thank you.
Thank you all.